Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics.
All right, we're back with Jessica Davis of Inside Intelligence, and there's a grab bag of different things to talk about this week. So I figured we would start with kind of where we're at in the foreign interference file, but how this also relates to these recent leaks coming out of the US. I know Jessica's had some thoughts about that on Twitter, so why don't we start there?
That sounds great. Yeah, it is quite the grab bag of all the kinds of national security stories this week. So, in terms of where we're at with the foreign interference story, basically, we know that the special rapporteur is going to be having, doing his investigative work, which is going to be really great. Broad access under his mandate, which is
Yeah.
really important. There's actually a possibility that we're going to be getting at some answers, which is really great. But I think the thing that's really happening behind the scenes that no one's really talking about is the ongoing investigation into who leaked this information. Now, depending on who you talk to, it's two leakers, three leakers, four leakers, who knows how many people are actually sharing information at this point in time. And I think that there's different levels of information sharing that's happening as well. So my own view is that there's definitely a couple of folks that are probably sharing information.
Mhm.
Probably one maybe two main leakers who have actually shared documents, and everyone else is probably adding a little bit of context here or there on the edges, or verbally corroborating information. But this investigation is ongoing and almost certainly causing quite a bit of uproar in the national security community. This kind of
Right.
leak is fairly unusual in Canada. We don't tend to have the kinds of leaks that, particularly the United States has. And it's an active investigation, like it's an active file. So
Yeah.
this is going to be causing quite a bit of consternation, I think, in the community.
Yeah, and that seems like, from what I'm hearing from people like Arturo Wilczynski and stuff like that, like there's a sense of kind of betrayal among some of the people in the community that these leaks have caused.
Yeah, I speak regularly to folks in the community, and there's definitely a lot of bad feelings about this, even from people who maybe disagree with the track that the government, this current government, or even previous governments have taken on it, because this is not the way that you get things done in the national security community. There are serious political implications to these leaks, and the public service is meant to be apolitical, to really hold itself above trying to influence day-to-day politics. And this is exactly the opposite of what the leaker has done. Like, the leaker has
Yeah.
really inserted themselves into this political discussion. So there's a lot of bad feelings right now. There's a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of energy being directed away from things that we could be focusing on, looking for the individual who leaked this information.
Yeah. One of the other things that happened last week was the government came out with their interim plan on how they're dealing with the recommendations of previous NSI COP and CIRA and so on, recommendations around foreign interference. And I'm wondering if you just had any thoughts on if you had a chance to read what they had as part of this update.
I haven't had a chance to get into that. Most of the work that I've been doing has really been focused on our foreign agent registry or
Right.
foreign actor registry. The consultation paper is up right now, so I've been putting a fair bit of time and effort into looking at that and sort of seeing what the comparables are, what that looks like, and if this will help to really address some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of foreign interference in Canada.
Speaking of comparables, I heard the former Prime Minister of Australia on TV a couple weeks ago saying that Australia's registry hasn't really worked as well as it should have. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that as part of what we should be looking at in Canada.
I think the big thing for me is really around whatever registry we set up has to have enforcement capabilities, and those enforcement capabilities have to be resourced. We can create new laws, we can create new registries all we want, but if we don't actually have the power to enforce them and to have meaningful consequences when you breach the terms of the registry, it's really just not worth the paper that it is written on. And we've seen this in a number of different national security areas. One of the interesting comparables, I think, is with FinTrack's administrative monetary penalty system that recently got revamped. So,
Okay.
to give them a lot more power to allow them to refer more information to the RCMP for criminal noncompliance with their act, and to really issue pretty significant fines. So that was like a tightening up and, giving a little bit more teeth to that. And that's the kind of thing that we want to see on the foreign interference file.
That kind of actually segues to the next topic I had, which was around, there's been a bunch of stories around sanctions enforcement and how we've basically overloaded the systems in Canada, which are supposed to be doing this enforcement. And I know this is something that you have talked about before in terms of we just don't have enough trained people doing this. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of give your take on where we're at right now.
So my very quick take on sanctions is they're a mess in Canada. So the government has been super active in terms of wanting to implement and to use our sanctions tool, in part to be seen to be leading on, particularly on the Ukraine issue, to work in lockstep with our partners, which is very important from a sanctions perspective, especially for a G7 economy. We really need to be making sure that we're not being exploited for sanctions evasion if, one of our allies is sanctioning folks and we're not. There's a whole bunch of coordination that's really important from this perspective. The problem in Canada is really when it comes down to implementation and enforcement of the sanctions. So we're great at implementing sanctions. There's been so many sanctions packages that have come out over the last year, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. So we're identifying the people that we want to sanction and we're saying you are sanctioned. It's everything that comes after that is a mess, like an absolute mess. So there's a few different pieces of it. So the capability to investigate sanctions is really limited in Canada. This is partly because of a lack of, in some cases, authorities. So, different departments and agencies don't have quite the right legislation. There's some pretty easy fixes around some of that stuff, making sure information flows. The other piece, though, is the trained investigators issue. The government did announce that they were going to be funding positions for people to investigate sanctions. Great. But you cannot just snap your fingers and all of a sudden have sanctions enforcement investigations going on. This is a multi-year process to train people to do these kinds of investigations properly. They're complex. I would say sanctions is probably right up there with serious, complex, organized criminal financial investigations in terms of how complex they can get, because we're talking about powerful, wealthy actors who have all of the resources at their disposal. So you can't have somebody coming in after attending a 1-week anti-money laundering course training and expect them to be able to actually detect sanctions evasion. So this is a huge issue. So that's kind of where we're at on the sanctions front. I know that the hiring is ongoing for some of those positions, but I think it'll all be complicated by the eventual establishment of the Financial Crimes Agency, which in the budget, the government told us that the economic update in the fall will have the plan for that. And again, where we're getting these financial investigators from is a huge question. Are we going to then take whoever's working on sanctions and put them in the Financial Crimes Agency? Because there's just no real process to be developing these people.
Yeah, that's and that kind of I guess just how do we set up or stand up a process to get these people into a system that will get them into there? I think that's an interesting question that a government that sometimes falters with implementation needs to really think about.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's so interesting about this is a problem that is going to span multiple election cycles, which is probably one of the reasons it's not being fixed, because somebody's going to have to make decisions that are going to only reap benefits 3 cycles down the road, because we're talking about education, we're talking about training, we're talking about professional development. It's probably a 10-year process before we really have the number of financial crimes investigators and people who can do sanctions evasion detection and investigations that we really need in Canada. So that's it's a bit of a tough sell politically.
No doubt. In spite of it being something that should be, nonpartisan or multipartisan, there's still going to be, this is politics after all. There's one last thing that happened this last week that you had also put out a really interesting Twitter thread on, and that was around the return or the repatriation of these women and children from Syrian detention camps and some of the narratives that can spring up around that. And I just wanted you, if you could just kind of lay out what your argument is there, just so that we have some more context in what's going on.
So the Twitter thread that I put together was really to try to stave off the knee-jerk reaction that I know is going to come from some corners about Canada being less safe because we repatriated these people. So my view is that that's not true. My view is very much that we've actually done the international community and international security a good service in getting these people out of those detention camps, that we have the skills and the capabilities in Canada to monitor these individuals, partly because we know who they are. So that's the easy part.
That seems to be half the battle.
It really is half the battle. So once we know who people are who might pose a threat to the security of Canada, and we can come back to that sort of might in a minute, then we have tools and we have processes that we can put in place. It's the unidentified people that are often, those are the ones that really keep me up at night, and that kept me up at night when I worked in the business, because, you know, if you're thinking about needles and haystacks, the ones that you can see are not the ones that we need to be the most concerned about. But that's that's kind of a whole other issue and probably worth another chat. But to come back to the potential threat that particularly these women pose, the issue here is really around where their head's at and what they're planning to do. So when I think about threat, I think about really five-pronged process. So the first one really relates to what their mindset is. So are they still radicalized? Do they still hold extremist ideas? For these women, it's hard to say to a certain extent for all of the people who have come back from Iraq and Syria, because they'll tend to tell you that they don't believe in the ideology anymore. That's fine. We can't take them at their word. So there has to be a little bit more that goes into that assessment.
Right.
But without that sort of extremist mindset, you're not going to get to the other four prongs of the threat. The second piece of it is really around intent. So what do they plan to do when they come back to Canada? Some of them might still hold extremist ideas, but their plans really involve around getting settled, getting their kids into school, and are really contained in that front. In which case, carry on, I say. Like, maybe we don't like your ideas, but there's lots of people around the world, or in Canada certainly, who have terrible ideas about things. We can't believe all of that. Right, exactly. So, and there's a small subset that might have some intent to, for example, conduct an attack. But, you know, as we go through these different stages, the number that we're talking about gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's still really all hypothetical at this point, because we just don't have the information to be making this determination, because we haven't done the investigation. We haven't done the interviews. Then it comes down to capability, planning, and preparation. So capability is around what kind of attack someone could potentially perpetrate if they were so inclined to do so. And it depends on like what kind of skills and training they might have had in Syria. Again, you need to have the background information to understand what that could be. Because when you have a low capability individual, what you end up getting is something like the Canadian Tire attack, in which that individual really just didn't have the capability to conduct any kind of sophisticated firearms attack. And in fact, her husband was taking weapons away from her to make sure that she couldn't. So she ended up going to a Canadian Tire and hitting people with a golf club. Now, I don't want to be hit by a golf club in Canadian Tire, but in terms of the spectrum of harms, that's really on the low end of capability, which is where we want to keep things. We want to keep it there.
Yeah.
And then it really comes down to planning and preparation. So if people have an extremist mindset, have the intent, have some sort of capability, then it's really up to security services and law enforcement to be monitoring them for planning and preparation activities. And this is where our counterterrorism tools really come in handy, because we have the power to intervene at this stage. The whole point of our counterterrorism legislation is to stop people when they're in, as we call it, the left of boom. So before they've had the chance to really go forward with their attack. So otherwise we'd be really looking at charges of like attempted murder. So we're trying to keep them in that left of boom space, focusing there. But again, because our law enforcement and security services know who they are, they should have pretty good capabilities in terms of identifying each of these different components and really mitigating that threat. So that's a really long way of saying, I don't think that these particular individuals pose a huge threat, and that threat is well managed within our existing capabilities.
Right. All right. Well, that's good context to have, because no doubt there are going to be people who will say things in the next few weeks as this moves forward. So these are good things to have in mind. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and we'll do this again soon.
It's always a pleasure. Take care.
Thanks.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.